Good afternoon. It is 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, and we want to welcome you to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. I want to say a very special welcome to the school from Colorado, a home of the Fighting Wolves. Thank you for joining us. I will tell you that our weather here is about 70 degrees, sunshiny, a little slight breeze blowing. I hope you're experiencing the same type of weather in Colorado, but I don't think so. Teachers, if you're watching and you're not signed up, go to www.tiny.cc/EEC register and sign up. Please register for us. This is just for our attendance records. Today, we're going to do a program on ecosystems. During this virtual field trips, students will interpret relationships, including predation, parasitism, commensalism, mutualism, and competition among organisms, and compare variations and adaptations of organisms in different ecosystems. Mr. Maris will tell you about predation, Ms. Fuller about symbiosis, Mr. Monroe competition, and Ms. Nash variations and adaptations. You cannot verbally speak to us during this program, but you can go to www.tiny.ce/EEC /question/answer and send us questions. I'll do my best to answer them during the program. If not, I will send the answers to your teachers. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Ms. Ramirez is going to tell you all about predation.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about predation. So before I start my PowerPoint presentation, I do have a quick little animal friend I want to show you guys. So before I get him out, let me tell you a little bit and give you some clues about who it might be, and then you guys can make your guess. So this animal originally comes from Australia. It is a cold-blooded animal, or an ectotherm. It has spikes on its body. It is covered in scales. It has 4 legs and 1 tail. It also has a beard of skin underneath its chin. So you guys can go ahead and think about what animal you think it is, and I'll pull him out. So this is Spike. He is a bearded dragon, and of course they get that name because they have a pouch of skin underneath their chin. When they get scared, they can inflate it and make themselves appear bigger. And then of course you can see he is indeed a reptile. His body is covered in scales. He also has spikes on the sides of his body. Now, what do you think his role is in a food web? So Spike here is both a predator and a prey. So he's a predator in the sense that he hunts other things such as insects to eat, but also he's a prey animal. So in Australia, animals like a dingo or even birds of prey like certain hawks might also eat him for food. So that is Spike, our bearded dragon. I'm gonna go ahead and put him up. Oops, he's jumping out of his box there. Whoa, there he goes. Okay, he's just running on the floor now. We're gonna go ahead and share my screen and we'll start our presentation. I'll have to find him later. So let me share the screen and the presentation. I have a couple of essential questions for you guys. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, you'll be able to answer these 2 questions. The first question is, give an example of how predation can shape or change communities. And the second question is, you should be able to give an example of a predator-prey relationship here at the EEC. So just to review, predation is one important way in which organisms interact with each other. And to review, a predator is the animal that hunts and consumes or eats another animal for food. And then of course, a prey, unfortunately, is the animal that is hunted and gets eaten. And again, many animals get their food from hunting or eating other animals, including us as humans. So it's totally normal and a natural part of any food web. So on our next slide, let's look at some examples of predation here at the Environmental Center. So as you watch the video, think about who might be a predator, who might be a prey, and then also think about which of these animals are omnivores, carnivores, or even an herbivore. And then let me go ahead and play the little movie. So here's evidence of predation at the center. So you can see an animal got into that chicken coop and unfortunately got one of our chickens. Unfortunately, it was Flash, who's that cool looking rooster there. So Flash, just like all animals, is part of the food web, and he provided energy to whatever ate him. That's Spike, the bearded dragon you guys saw earlier. Here's an owl pellet. So even though we might not actually see the animal getting eaten, we see indirect evidence of those predator-prey relationships. So an owl pellet is not poop. Instead, it's actually vomit. So whatever the animal can't digest, the owl will actually cough up those fur and bone remains in the form of a pellet. So contrary to what a lot of people believe, an owl pellet is actually just a regurgitated ball of undigested material. It is not poop. And then other birds actually release a pellet as well. Now here is poop. This is coyote scat. And then there's my chicken Pepper eating some mealworms. And then this is Basil, my ball python, eating a mouse. So she is a carnivore, and she only eats meat. And this whole process took a little over 10 minutes for her to completely consume that mouse. Basil's a ball python, so she's not venomous. She's a constrictor. So the way that she hunts her prey is by grabbing them where they're really sharp, recurved teeth, and then she will use her strong muscular body to squeeze it until it can't breathe, and then she will slowly swallow it whole, like you guys saw in the video. So I thought that was pretty cool and interesting to watch. So the next thing we're going to talk about is predation as a density dependent factor. And what that means is a density dependent factor is essentially any factor that depends on the number of members in a population. So examples of density dependent factors would be, of course, predation, but also other biotic factors such as disease, parasites, or even competition. So again, predation is density dependent. Now on the opposite side, we also have what are called density independent factors, and those are factors that don't depend on the number of members in a population. So see if you can think of some examples that might be density independent. And then let's take a look at a couple of these graphs. This first graph is a predator prey graph. So think about, analyze the graph. What can you infer from it? What can you learn from it? So we can see here in this graph, hopefully you guys are able to notice that there's a correlation between the number of prey and the number of predators. So we know that those numbers are related. So as the number of prey increase, consequently, so does the number of predators, and that's because there's more food available, so those predators are able to reproduce because they have enough food or resources. Now, what do you think might happen if we totally removed the number of predators from an area? What would cause the rabbit population to continue a cyclic pattern if we were to remove those predators? So think about that question. And then also over here, we see a couple of examples of graphs. This first graph is an exponential growth graph, and the second graph is a logistic population growth graph. So compare and contrast those two, and what do you think we can learn from them? So if we take a look at the exponential growth, essentially we're seeing that a population is just increasing exponentially. Now, typically an exponential growth is not really feasible in the typical environment because, of course, we know that resources are limited. So typically when we think of exponential growth, we typically think of things like bacteria and yeast. However, just keep in mind that for most populations, they're not going to be able to experience that exponential growth. Eventually, they're going to hit what we call a carrying capacity because there's going to be limited resources. And then, of course, you can see here where we are talking about that carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is just the max number of individuals that an environment can support. Again, remember, resources are limited, and that's why there are carrying capacities. And then this is just a quick review of what that carrying capacity is. And then again, just realize that resources are limited. So the amount of food available, the amount of water and space, all of those resources are limited. And that is what limits a population from growing exponentially. And then one of your essential questions is how does predation shape communities? So predators will affect the size of prey populations in a community because, of course, they're hunting them. And then they also determine the places that prey can live and feed. So think about, you're probably not going to find a lot of prey if there's a particular, for example, lion territory, if that's known where these lions have their territory. You're probably not going to find a lot of prey animals there. So predation can affect the size of a prey population and also where you're going to find those prey as well. On the other side, we also have examples of how our herbivores can also affect populations, especially with our plants. So you can see some examples here. Some that relate to the environmental center would be the cattle grazing. So if we have cattle that are overgrazing an area, they're going to completely destroy all the grass in one area. So a lot of time, cattle ranchers will rotate their cattle through different pastures to allow that grass time to regrow. And my last little thing is a quick challenge activity for you guys. If y'all go to the FET Natural Selection Simulation, and I have the website here, it's a cool little website where you can play around with some environmental factors, and you can see, can you help the bunny population survive? And then also think about what are the minimum conditions that cause all the bunnies to die. So let me just show you guys that website super quick so you can see what I'm talking about. So here's the website. It's totally free. It does deal mostly with natural selection, but you have the option to add in some environmental factors here. So you start off with one bunny, say I want to add a mate, and then when I add some predators in there, maybe limit the amount of food available, and then you can see how many bunnies will reproduce after so many generations, and then also how many bunnies survive depending upon the number of predators that you add in. So you guys can play around with that little simulation as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share, and really quickly, I just want to show you one last predator here at the center, and that is Pelota. She's a ball python, similar to the one you guys saw in the video, but she's a lot bigger than Basil is. So Pelota here is a carnivore, so she will hunt rodents and mice as well. So I'm going to go ahead and put her up. That's all I have for you guys. We're going to give it back to Dr. Gorman to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Ramirez. That ball python looked like he was checking us all out here for a minute. I hope we're too big for him. And a student wanted to know about a definition or an example of predation, besides the one that you showed. It's the killing of one living organism of another one for food. Small fish are most vulnerable to predation just after sunset, when larger fish such as barracuda and jacks chase them into shallow water near shore to feed on them where they can't get away. Those fish will actually herd a school of fish, small fish up into shallow water, and then start eating them. And now Ms. Fuller is going to tell you about symbiosis.
Good afternoon, boys and girls. We're going to be talking about symbiosis this afternoon. So let me share my screen with you, and we'll get started on our program here. Symbiosis, how organisms help one another. So you've got a roundworm over here, and you've got some lichen, and then over on the other side you have some moss. Well, what do these things have in common? Well, they're all interrelated. They're helping or hurting different organisms. So let's look at some essential questions to keep in mind as we go through the program. Which type of symbiosis benefits both organisms, and which type of symbiosis benefits one organism, but neither helps nor hurts the other? Now below us, we see a couple of examples of symbiosis. We have, on the right, we have a hermit crab who's inhabiting the shell of a dead, looks like a lightning whelk. Might be a knob whelk. Well, depends on whether it's left-handed or right-handed, correct? So he's found a home in a discarded shell. And on the left, you have a rhinoceros that's got a kind of bird perching on him called an oxpecker. And this guy helps the rhinoceros by picking things like ticks and other bothersome insects off of the rhinoceros. The rhinoceros gives the oxpeckers a ride. He provides food via the insects, and they help him. So they're mutually helpful. Now, what is symbiosis? Symbiosis is a relationship between two organisms of different species when one lives near, on, or inside the other. And there are three types. So down here, we've got a pollinator, which is a bee. The bee helps the flower by collecting pollen, and the flower helps the bee by providing nectar. So they are mutually beneficial. In the middle, we have an example of parasitism. And what we have here is we have a leaf that was stung by a little tiny wasp, and it laid its egg. And so the plant spent energy and material to build these little galls to protect itself from the little wasps. So that's parasitism. Then over on the right, you have a woodpecker that is got its family in that hole in that tree. So that's commensalism. It's not really hurting the tree, but it's not helping the tree either. So what is mutualism? It's a type of symbiosis where both organisms benefit. Over on the left, you've got two organisms that exist together, a fungi and an algae. The algae provides the food-making mechanism, the chlorophyll, and the fungi provides the structure. And you can find these things don't have to grow, and you see them growing on trees, but you can see them growing on rocks all over the place. They're just hanging out there. And over on the right, you see our little Nemo friend, the clownfish, nestled into the arms of a sea anemone. The sea anemone is covered in stinging cells called nematocysts, but the clownfish exudes a type of protection on its skin, so it's not bothered by the sting of the nematocyst. The clownfish is protected by the anemone, but the anemone also benefits by the presence of the clownfish, because very often organisms will be attracted to where the clownfish is that are not immune to the stings of the nematocysts, which can provide food for the anemone. The anemone is not a plant, even though it looks a little bit like a flower. It's actually an animal. Parasitism is a type of symbiosis where one organism benefits and the other is hurt. We've got two classic examples here. One is the insect gall, very similar to the one I showed you a minute ago. And then over on the right, you've got mistletoe. Mistletoe is a parasite, and those clumps of leaves are not the leaves of the tree. Those are the clumps of the mistletoe. Taps into the vascular system of the tree and robs it of nutrients and water. Usually you don't see it gaining a foothold on a tree unless the tree is stressed. Now, commensalism is a type of symbiosis where one organism benefits and the other is neither help nor hurt. Now, over on the left, we've got a tree, and in it is an epiphyte, an air plant. But in this particular case, they're orchids, but they're unlike the mistletoe, it's not tapped into the vascular system of the tree. It's simply using the tree as a place to hang out. So the tree provides a place for the orchid to grow, but it doesn't contribute to the nutrients or where the lamprey it essentially consumes its host. The lamprey is a parasite. This little guy just hangs on for the ride. So the shark provides transportation and also protection for the little remora fish. But this type of remora fish and that's permanent housing. And the example of that would be the woodpecker that lives in the tree. Metabiosis is where one organism forms a habitat for another. And kind of a gross example of that would be maggots living inside a dead body. Foracy that's pH, not FOR. Foracy is when an organism attaches to another for transport. We've already seen two examples of that, the oxpecker on the rhinoceros, and then also this remora fish on this shark. And then the last one is microbiota, and this is one that you're participating in as we speak. And this is when organisms form communities with the host. For example, on our skin, we have a biota, we have skin bacteria. And so we've got lots of bacteria on our skin, and that's simply a one version of commensalism. So I've lost my cursor. There it goes. Okay. And when I was coming in the building this morning, look what I found on the ground right outside my classroom. It's an insect gall. This is like the ones that you saw pictures of in here for parasitism. So symbiosis is very fascinating, and it's all walks of life. And I encourage you to look for examples of symbiosis as you go out to the field in the forest. Dr. Gorman will answer any questions you have about symbiosis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fuller, for that extremely long vocabulary lesson. I'll have to look up a bunch of them words, but I don't remember them. A student wants to know what's the difference between symbiosis and mutualism. I think she covered that, but we want to answer it anyhow. Symbiosis refers to a close, prolonged association between two organisms of different species. Mutualism refers to mutual beneficial interaction between members of the same or different species. And now Mr. Monroe is going to tell you all about competition.
Good afternoon, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking into the term competition. Well, you probably hear that word a lot, but we're talking about competition within an ecosystem. And of course, we know that an ecosystem consists of living things that live in a particular area, along with non-living things and how they interdepend on each other. Within that ecosystem, there are a lot of different relationships that go on. Of course, we know that there's, if you are considered to be living and whatever factors that are considered to be living in that ecosystem, they have basic needs to help them stay alive and go through what we call life processes. Food, water, shelter, and space are the basic needs of most living things. And so basically, those are resources that sometimes they have to compete for. Well, to help me with this presentation, I've got a little short PowerPoint, and we're going to use that. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to share my screen with you guys. Competition and ecosystems. Relationships in ecosystems. Now, Ms. Ramirez has talked to you, and she went over predation. Ms. Fuller went over symbiotic relationships. And so those are a variety of relationships. In fact, 3 relationships that occur actually in an ecosystem. Competition, predation, and parasitism. Now the parasitism, you know, that's symbiotic, and Ms. Ramirez went over predation. I'm going to be going over competition. What is competition? Today, we're looking at 2 types of competition: interspecific, intraspecific. There are 2 different types. What I want you guys to be able to do is to define each one of them at the end of this program and to be able to explain the difference between the 2. competition. When does competition occur? Well, that happens when organisms require the same or similar resources. They're based to fulfill their basic needs. What type of resources do organisms compete for? Light, water, food, space, and even reproductive mates. Competition can be either interspecific or intraspecific. Now, when we're talking about interspecific competition, we're actually talking about the type of competition that involves or it occurs between members of different species in an ecosystem who require similar resources. In this image here, we have hyenas and an actual lion competing for food. This is a perfect example of what we call interspecific competition. Now, another example would be red and gray squirrels, brown or rainbow trout, different species competing for the same type of resource. And out here at the Environmental Ed Center, we see a lot of that because we have 300 acres that we have nature trails in, and it is inhabited by a variety of animals such as white-tailed deer, raccoons, bobcats, armadillos, a variety, and foxes. We have a variety of animals over there that are competing for those basic needs like food, water, shelter, and space. The organisms require similar but not exactly the same resources, and that's what usually occurs when we have interspecific competition. Now, intraspecific competition is a little different. This occurs between members of the same species in an ecosystem who require the same resources. Some examples would be robins in a garden or rabbits in a field. They're two different species, but they're requiring or they want the same food resource. This often is more intense as the same resources are needed. Now, I want you to remember that. When the same resources are needed, it becomes more intense. Can you answer the following questions if they were on a test? Could you say, what is competition? What do plants compete for? Which type of competition is most intense and why? What is intraspecific competition? What do animals compete for? Another type of relationship between organisms, and you surely know that by now through Mrs. Ramirez and Ms. Fuller. What is interspecific competition? Give an example of each type of competition and another type of relationship between organisms. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen with you, and we're going to talk about some of the relationships that we have existing here in the Post Oak Preserve, where our center is located in Seagoville, Texas. Here lately, we've noticed in the last few years, we've had a growing population of white-tailed deer. We've also had a growing population of something that is kind of plaguing the state of Texas, and that is feral pigs, wild hogs. Now, the Post Oak Preserve is where we have our nature trails. And the Post Oak Preserve is primarily named that simply because most of the trees that are inhabiting that preserve are post oak, which when they produce their seeds are in the form of acorns. The white-tailed deer, they definitely want to feed on the acorns. The feral pigs, they definitely want to feed on the acorns. So there we have what type of competition. Would it be interspecific competition or would it be intra-specific competition? I'm going to leave that with you guys. And you know what? If any of you have any questions, I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman, and maybe he can answer those questions for you. You guys have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. And if I were those hyenas, I think I'd hunt for something else to eat, because that lion has some big teeth. Okay, we have a student that wants a precise definition of competition. Let me put my spectacles on here. What happens when you get old, kids? Competition arises whenever two or more parties strive for a common goal which cannot be shared, where one's gain is the other's loss. Competition includes rivalry between entities such as organisms, individuals, economic, and social groups. I think Mr. Monroe really did a good job of explaining that to you. And now Ms. Nash is going to talk to you about variations and adaptations.
Hello, welcome to my classroom. Today we're going to be talking about different kinds of variations in plants in different ecosystems. So lots of different ecosystems, and plants have adapted to every single one. And there's some really amazing things going out there. And you can, if you have a garden at home or at the school or in town, botanical garden perhaps, or even just your houseplants, you can observe a lot of these things right there in person. The great thing about plants is they can't run away. So let's look at some pictures and think about some of those really amazing variations and adaptations that they have for survival. So we have lots of different biomes and ecosystems, and you talk about kind of a few of the major ones around. And of course, up there in Colorado, you've got those high mountains, and they've got lots of conifer forests mainly. You've got a few deciduous trees like aspen mixed in there. In other parts of the country, that's altitude, they've got big deciduous forests. The North American continent was one gigantic forest from the Atlantic to the Mississippi originally until the Europeans got here. So these forests depend on rain. Trees need a lot of water, okay, to grow. So, and they're competing for sun. So these trees are growing up high as they can to get the sun. Another big biome are the rainforests. And the ones I think are so amazing are these tree ferns. So these are ancient trees. They were dinosaurs. The dinosaurs were munching on them. Okay. In most of the world, they've disappeared. Okay. They're giant tree ferns. Okay. And in these forests, you also have what we call epiphytes. And Mrs. Fuller showed you that orchid. But another really common epiphyte are the bromeliads. And these are epiphytes, just means they grow in a tree. Okay? They don't grow in the soil. So they're using the space differently. Okay? They're using the trees as their space to grow. Okay? So high up, they're away from browsing animals like what we have sometimes little deer down there or rabbits. They're not there up in the trees, so they're kind of safe. And they get water in the cup that they have. Okay. And of course, these are mainly tropical plants. We had a big cold snap and my greenhouse lost power, and all of my bromeliads and all of my beautiful ferns died. It's very sad. They did not like that cold weather. Some plants like the giant water lily, this water lily over here on the left, a child could sit on it. They're gigantic. Some plants grow entirely in the water, but most plants can't grow in that standing water. Their roots basically drown. In Texas here, we have a plant we call the bald cypress. That's over here if you go out to East Texas and see them, and they grow in the water. And they have specialized roots. They have what we call leaves that come up above the water level. And then a really amazing and really important plant for coastal erosion, helping prevent coastal erosion, is the mangrove. And the mangrove is one of the few trees that can actually grow in kind of brackish water. That's where the water comes in and out from the ocean. Okay? And so they're growing and they're holding soil and they're protecting coastal areas. So they're really important. So that's some really unique adaptations that these plants have to let them survive in places that other plants can't. And if we go west from where we are today, out into the desert, we find really challenging habitats. So these are very often very hot areas, lots of evaporation of any rainfall that falls, and very little water. And so plants have had to really adapt both to survive the lack of water and also to somehow prevent the animals who are also thirsty from eating them as a way to get water. So the cactus family is one of the most really interesting groups of plants on the planet. They're unique to the Americas, to North and Central and South America, and they have lost their leaves entirely. Leaves dry out, and so the cactus got rid of them. So they do photosynthesis in their green stems. So see this prickly hair here, there's no bud, and the green stem is where they're doing photosynthesis. And no leaves anymore, but they've got all these spines. So they got these big sharp ones, and then these little blockages are almost words. Okay, if you ever sit on one, you'll know. And they hold a leathery outside covering to that stem and holds the water. They open their stoma at night when there's less evaporation. So they're really uniquely adapted to the desert. They come in lots and lots of different forms and shapes, and flowers are beautiful. And then other desert plants that still have leaves, they've adapted their leaves for survival. So this agave here has really thick leathery leaves if you ever feel one, and the edges are serrated knives, and then the points on these leaves are like a needle. Okay? In fact, the native people used to pound the leaf and it has fibers inside, and they would make a needle and thread out of one leaf. Really amazing. And then one of the most interesting adaptations, and you can maybe look some of this up on the internet and read about it. Here in Texas, we have a place called the Big Thicket National Preserve, and it's a number of places out in East Texas, far East Texas, where it's very rainy, and a big forest, a thick forest, hence the name Big Thicket. And the unique adaptations, there are 5 kinds of carnivorous plants in North America, and we have 4 of them out there in the Big Thicket. And these are the 4 we have. We have the pitcher plant right here. Insects fall in this pitcher, and it's got nectar inside to attract them. And there's kind of hairs that go point down. They can't get out, and they get digested. The sundew here has this sticky stuff on the leaf here. The insect will stick to it and get digested. Okay. The butterwort has a weird like projections on the stem that kind of engulf a little insect. And the bladderwort is really amazing. It's a floating plant, and it eats like tiny water animals, under like Daphnia, under the water. Pretty amazing. Why do they do this? Well, they grow in a bog where the nutrients in the soil have been leached out by the water. So there's not any nutrients in the soil. So they have learned to, or they've evolved to get their nutrients from insects. Okay, so pretty amazing. That famous Venus flytrap only occurs in North and South Carolina, but we've got 4 of the 5, so pretty good. And here where we are, and up in Colorado, also out in the eastern part of Colorado, you have a lot of prairie. So prairies were grass, mainly dominated by grasses and lots of other flowering plants, herbs and different, like over here in this picture, we've got goldenrod and some others. I can't really tell what they are from the picture, but these are fire adapted habitats. And so without fire, you tend to lose them basically to trees. So the Native Americans, the Indians set fire to the prairie periodically to renew the grass, okay, and keep the trees out because they wanted those buffalo for hunting. So without the fire, the prairie tends to disappear. The plants have really deep roots because it's a habitat with variations in temperature and rainfall. Okay, so you got heat and drought, we got cold, we got hot, really hot summers and cold winters. We've got periods of heavy rainfall and then long periods of no rainfall. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And you want to think about all those variations in the plant world. So all these things are ways that they've adapted to the different habitats, and they've done it in different ways. Okay? So this plant is a little cactus that has little thorns on it, and agave would have a different adaptation to that same sort of a habitat. And here's a beautiful begonia with those big leaves, okay, that might be growing in a kind of rainforest on the ground. And here's a vermilion will be hanging out up in a tree, okay, waiting for rain to fall into the center here. And that's how they get their water. And also their nutrients, little bugs and things fall in there. And then they dissolve and feed the plant also. They have roots, but just to attach to a tree. So really amazing ways that plants have adapted to all kinds of different niches in their habitat. So lots of fun things to learn and observe. And if you have any questions, you can ask Dr. Gorman.
Thank you, Ms. Nash. And Ms. Nash mentioned something that I'm always amazed about. The amount of information that's available to you students today. Now, whenever I was your age, if you wanted to know something that you didn't know, you had to go to the library and look it up in an encyclopedia or a dictionary or something. And you guys have, immediate access to a wealth of knowledge. I'm totally envious of you. But now the question was, give us a definition of adaptation. Adaptation is developed when certain variations or differences in a population help some members survive better than others. The variation may already exist within the population, but often the variation comes from a mutation or random change in an organism's genes. An example that I always like to use is the long necks on giraffes. That enables them to eat vegetation and all that other animals cannot get to. So I guess as long as there's long necked giraffes and trees around, everybody will be happy. Thank you again, Ms. Nash. And now I am going to share my screen. This program during this virtual field trips, student interpreted relationships included predation, parasitism, commensalism, mutualism, and competition among organisms, and compare variations and adaptations of organisms in different ecosystems. Ms. Ramirez covered predation. Ms. Fuller did symbiosis. Mr. Moreau talked to you about competition. And Ms. Nash just covered variations and adaptations. Thank you, teachers. How did we do? If you would, please go to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and fill out a short form and send it back to us. We would appreciate it. Thank you again, guys. Have a great day. And also, more importantly, have a great life.